Look at that issue. First, we want to show you what the president had to say in April 1961 about a naval blockade around Cuba.
It is clear that this nation, in concert with all the free nations of this hemisphere, must take an ever closer and more realistic look at the menace of external communist intervention and domination in Cuba. The American people are not complacent about Iron Curtain tanks and planes less than 90 miles from their shore. But a nation of Cuba's size is less a threat to our survival than it is a base for subverting the survival of other free nations throughout the hemisphere. It is not primarily our interest or our security, but theirs, which is now today in the greater peril. It is for their sake, as well as our own, that we must show our will. The evidence is clear and the hour is late. We and our Latin friends will have to face the fact that we cannot postpone any longer the real issue of survival of freedom in this hemisphere itself. On that issue, unlike perhaps some others, there can be no middle ground. Together we must build a hemisphere where freedom can flourish and where any free nation under outside attack of any kind can be assured that all of our resources stand ready to respond to any request for assistance.
Timothy Naftali is the author of One Hell of a Gamble, and it was 2 years previous, in 1959, almost to the day, that Fidel Castro lands in Washington, D.C. at the Old National Airport, April 15th. 2 years later, on April the 17th, we're invading that country. Give us the history.
Well, Fidel Castro, when he arrives in the United States, is a rock star. Absolutely. He is the most exciting leader in the entire Third World, not just in Latin America. And the United States government was not sure about him. By 1958, middle of 1958, the Eisenhower administration had given up on the regime of Fulgencio Batista, the Batista regime in Cuba. The U.S. government had started to withdraw, and the Castro group, the July 26 group, was the only alternative. Castro comes to power, and the U.S. government wants to know, are you a communist? And is your brother Raul a communist? And how close are you to Che Guevara, whom everyone assumed was a communist? Fidel comes on a charm offensive to North America. He comes to the United States. He goes to Harvard. He speaks in front of Harvard students. In fact, the dean of students at the time was a man named McGeorge Bundy, who would figure rather prominently in the story 2 years later. Castro even meets with Vice President Richard Nixon. And Nixon finds him charming and interesting, although Nixon is concerned that perhaps Castro is too naive to the threat of communist insurgency in his own country. Well, of course, within about 6 months, the Eisenhower administration is going to start to think about perhaps ways of overthrowing Castro. The Eisenhower administration is going to take about a year to build up a capability. But by the middle of 1959, Washington has turned against Castro already. The interesting thing to keep in mind is that one set of data that we didn't know, or they didn't know in 1959, was that Castro was actually playing footsie with the Soviets a lot earlier than the United States had assumed. While he was here visiting, actually while he was giving a speech at Harvard, his brother had sent a missionary, an emissary to Moscow to say to the Soviets, listen, we need your help. We need your help because our army, the Cuban army, is not dependable. And many people in our army are pro-American. And if we want to move our revolution to the left, we're going to have the support of an army, and you've got to teach us how to build cadres within the army of Marxist-Leninists that we can rely on. So often in our history, we discover that the challenges we face were exaggerated by U.S. intelligence. This is a case where, in fact, the challenge from the Castro group was underestimated by the CIA when Castro came to the United States in 1959.
You lay the groundwork in your book for the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Bay of Pigs invasion, and a key part of that, obviously, the relationship between the U.S. Kennedy in particular, and Khrushchev. What was it like?
Oh, well, here you have to step back a bit, and I don't know if the viewers and your listeners had a chance to read some of the transcripts of the Saddam Hussein tapes, which the United States captured. These tapes primarily cover the middle 90s, and I bring this up because there's an interesting parallel between Saddam Hussein and Nikita Khrushchev. Both Iraq in the 1990s and the Soviet Union in the 1950s felt that it was way, way behind the United States and very vulnerable to an American attack. Khrushchev felt the only way to deter an American attack was to act like a pufferfish, to puff himself up, to exaggerate his potentials, in a sense to exaggerate what would be later called WMDs, in order to avoid an American attack. What happens is that his efforts to bluff begin to fail. He tries to bluff to get his way in Berlin. He wants the West out of West Berlin. He bluffs in order to get a better deal on nuclear testing. He doesn't get it. And so by 1962, he is looking for a way to show Soviet power to the United States, to demonstrate we are on the same level as you are and you cannot push us around. And that's why he sends missiles to Cuba. The Bay of Pigs, which of course we're celebrating the anniversary of today, is important because it was a reminder to the Soviets of how fragile its allies were in the Third World. Here you had the Soviet Union, which had this sense that the future belonged to it. But the present was much more difficult. The Soviets understood that in region after region, Soviet power was not at the same level as U.S. power, that Soviets could not protect their allies in places like in Indonesia, in Egypt, and in Cuba, because the United States had this force projection capability. So the Bay of Pigs in 1961 was, even though it collapsed, the American aggression was viewed by the Soviets as yet another example of how much stronger the United States was than the Soviet Union.
So it was on the morning of April 17th that about 1,300 Cuban exiles, supported by the CIA, move into Cuba. But 7 days before that, there is this memo written by the president's advisor, Arthur Schlesinger. It's called Cuba, Political, Diplomatic, and Economic Problems. What did he advise the president?
Well, Arthur Schlesinger didn't want the United States to proceed with the invasion. His sense was that this was a mistake, and there were some of Kennedy's advisors, though not many, who shared this view. The policy process collapsed around Kennedy before the Bay of Pigs, which is why after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy tried to revamp his sort of national security team. He didn't change figures. He didn't move people around, with the exception of Allen Dulles, who was the director of CIA, who was asked, basically given a nice retirement. But what Kennedy does is he tries to get his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, to control the information, the inputs that are coming to him better than he had before the Bay of Pigs. What Kennedy believes is that he was not really given the right information that he required to judge the CIA plan. Kennedy makes some mistakes before the Bay of Pigs, not simply endorsing and executing the plan, but he changes the plan. You've got to remember that Kennedy is a politician, and he is somebody who wants, as President of the United States, to make this covert action as deniable as possible. Now, there is an absolute inconsistency. There's a tension between a military or paramilitary operation and secrecy. At a certain point, the bombs are going to go off, the men are going to land on the beach, and the world is going to know that it's happening. Keeping the hand of the United States secret while overseeing an overt military action is very difficult, arguably impossible. And so what is happening before April 17th is Kennedy is saying, find me a way, CIA, to do this without revealing our hand. And so he starts tinkering with the project. He moves the landing site. He moves the landing site to a much more remote swamp because he feels that way perhaps the world won't cover it. He asks that the airstrikes that are an important part of creating an air superiority for the Cuban emigres who are flying American planes, that those airstrikes, first of all, that the number of U.S. planes be dropped, and then ultimately that the second airstrike not happen. All of these decisions are based on his concern that the U.S. should not show its hand in this operation. Well, the world knew that if a group of Cuban emigres arrived on World War II era planes and World War II era landing ships, that stuff would probably be from the United States. But Kennedy had allowed himself to be convinced that this could be done secretly. After the Bay of Pigs, he realizes, oh my God, what a fool I was. And he didn't have enough doubting Thomases around him, like Arthur Schlesinger and others, to ask the right question, say, wait a second, why are we convinced that we can move, first of all, that we can move all this stuff into Cuba and no one's going to say it's an American operation, and two, that once these exiles get into Cuba, that they're going to meet a population that will receive them and will overthrow Cuba, the Cuban regime. I mean, after all, there were 1,400 in this invasion force. In 1960, during the first invasion scare in Cuba, Fidel Castro arranged for a mobilization of 300,000 militia. 1,400 people are not going to overthrow 300,000 militia plus the Cuban army. What you had to assume was that you'd have this revolution against Castro, or counter-revolution. That was just a complete fallacy. Kennedy didn't ask the right questions.
Our guest, Timothy Naftali, who is the author of One Hell of a Gamble, and he's a graduate of Harvard University and soon to head up the Nixon Library. You were appointed earlier this month. You'll take over in October of this year.
I will indeed.
To do what?
Well, my goal is to open the library to everyone, to make it a place of debate and discussion for scholars and the general public, and to oversee the transfer of Nixon's 44 million pages from Washington, D.C. to Yorba Linda.
And this is a story last week in the Washington Post, including a photograph from Yorba Linda, California, one of President Nixon's limousines. But the story basically says fewer people are visiting these presidential libraries. Why the downturn?
Well, this is a new job for me. I can't say. I can tell you that what you really want to do is to make your museum interactive. And you've got to think about your target audience. I think you have really two targets. One, kids, 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds to 15-year-olds. And they are computer savvy. And looking at old furniture, I don't think is going to do it for them. They're just not, it's not going to interest them. And your other audience are the people who were alive when that particular president was in office, or people who are particularly engaged in that era. Well, unfortunately, the latter group grows smaller over time. And the young people are less interested in traditional museums. So the real challenge, I think, for a museum director is to make it more interactive, the whole experience more interactive.
Our phone lines are open for Republicans. The number to call is 202-737-0001. For Democrats, 202-737-0002. We have a line for Independents. Macomb, Illinois is first up. Good morning.
Good morning. I was in the Navy in Key West during this period on a submarine. And my feeling about Kennedy, I was pro-Kennedy, voted for him, and when the invasion happened, I really lost a great deal of respect for President Kennedy. I felt that if we were going to allow people to train in our country, allow them for us to put them ashore, and then just let them die there without a little air cover to help them out, it kind of soured me on Kennedy. I was on the Cuban blockade on a submarine, and we did see Russian ships coming, and we never let them know that we were there. We used communication to talk to a cruiser that was downrange about 20 miles, and he came roaring up and challenged the cargo ship with long, big boxes up on deck cargo and sent them packing back through the straits back out into the ocean and gone, I guess. But I I'm going to buy your book. I'm very interested in that period of time.
Well, listen, first of all, I think just thank you for your service. But, you know, when I teach Cold War history, sir, it's very hard to convey to 20-year-olds the psychology and emotions of the Cold War. Because ultimately nothing happened, right? You were out there in a submarine, and thank God you did not find yourself in an engagement with the Soviets. But you could have. And it's that anxiety and fear that so dominated the Cold War that's very hard to convey to students. You know what we learned after the fact, I mean, when the documents started to come out of the Soviet Union in 1991, was that the Soviet submarines were all over. There weren't a lot of them, but they were actually engaged in some pretty risky behavior during the Cuban Missile Crisis and during November of 1962, and it was just dumb luck that we didn't have some kind of altercation between a U.S. sub and the Soviet sub.
Timothy Naftali is also the author of Blind Spot, The Secret History of American Counterterrorism, and our next call comes to us from Indianapolis. Good morning.
Morning.
I've been a student of the Bay of Pigs invasion ever since I went to Havana 5 years ago. And one of the most interesting facts in the wing of the Revolutionary Museum, which was Batista's former presidential palace, is the wing on the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which they have journals and photos of taken at the time. And one of the most interesting facts was that two of the invasion ships were named Barbara, and it was either Houston or Zapata, which leads to the question of who those ships named after.
Oh, I've heard that theory. Are you talking about the first President Bush? No.
Poppy Bush, as distinguished from Junior, the current president.
No, I don't. I think that's a coincidence. I will say this. I also went to Havana for the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I did visit that museum. I also found the wreckage of the American U-2 interesting to look at. What's really striking about the Cuban story is how uncertain they were in the days preceding the invasion as to whether the United States was going to attack or not. I mean, the Cubans had a lot of good intelligence on the fact that we were training counter-revolutionaries in Guatemala. The Guatemalan communists were sending information to the Cubans and to the Soviets. But the information was vague. They exaggerated the number of counter-revolutionaries, and nobody really knew D-Day, the actual date of the invasion. And so the Cuban government was quite hormonal before. I mean, a certain day they thought it was going to happen, another day they weren't sure it was going to happen. Che Guevara goes to the Soviets on, I think, about April 14th and says, we don't think Kennedy's going to do anything. It's not going to happen. And Kennedy himself gives a speech. Actually, it was a press conference where he says, you know, the Cubans have to resolve this problem on their own. The United States is not going to resolve it.
Is that part of his deniability?
It was a part of his deniability. But you know what? The Soviets accepted it. The chief of the KGB in Havana leaves and goes to Brazil. And my Russian co-author, Alexander Fursenko, was able to interview that man. He's no longer alive. His name is Alexeyev. But they asked him, well, why'd you leave? I mean, one of the arguments is, well, the Soviets knew the attack was going to come and they wanted to protect their KGB guy. Well, he says, no, we didn't know it was going to. We just didn't think it was going to happen.
How did they recruit and train these 1,300 or 1,400 exiles? Where were they trained? And you point out that about 1,800 or 1,100 were captured. What happened to them after that?
Oh, well, first of all, they were trained in Nicaragua, and they were also trained in Louisiana. Well, I guess it was 1,189 were captured, and the United States bartered for them. The United States sent a man who had been William J. Donovan's general counsel, a guy named James Donovan, no relation to him, to Havana to negotiate with Castro. And the deal was that these men were released in 1963 in return for medicine. I'd be interested that James Donovan was asked by the CIA to bring with him a scuba suit, which was to be lined with curare, a deadly poison. This was the period when the CIA was trying to kill Castro, and Donovan did not bring the suit as a gift from the United States. It would have messed up the negotiations.
And 114 were killed during the invasion.
114 were killed, and 14 were actually rescued by the U.S. Navy.
Next call comes to us from Edwardsville, Illinois. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'm really enjoying your speaker today. It's very informative. I've never really understood the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis.
Madam, the President didn't understand the Bay of Pigs either. You're not alone.
That's right. And, I was 10 years old when he was assassinated, and I know the feeling of just everybody loved Kennedy, and he's just like died a martyr. But if the things he did occurred today with 24/7 cable and C-SPAN, and where we could all, just dissect it and look at it and understand it really well, he would have been a hated president. Don't you agree?
No. No. If we're just talking about the Bay of Pigs, I don't agree with you. If we're talking about all elements of Kennedy, including his private life, since mores have shifted and journalists ask different questions these days, I think you would have had a Lewinsky-like scandal for JFK. But about the Bay of Pigs, here's why I don't think it would have had the effect that you predict. Kennedy, within a few days, admitted error. I think journalists go after leaders when they don't admit error. And when they find ways to say, oh, we're doing well, we're on the right course, stay the course, that sort of thing. When leaders come out and say, I messed up, which is exactly what Kennedy did. I said something like, success has has many fathers, and defeat is an orphan, and I take responsibility for this error. And privately, he said, look, I think he said this to Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA. He said, in the British parliamentary system, Kennedy, would have to resign as prime minister. But in the American system, it is you, Alan Dulles, who will have to resign. He recognized that he'd made a mistake in not asking the right questions. And I think that would have given him some immunity. He was criticized. My goodness, if you look at the newspaper editorials about Kennedy, and this was hard for him. Imagine Kennedy as a man who never failed. His failures in life were the medical conditions he had. I mean, I guess he was given the last rites 3 times. But in terms of, as a professional, he'd never failed. He was a golden boy. This was his first big failure. And it was hard on him. But because he took responsibility, I suspect he would have come out of it pretty well. In any case, in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis gave him the best poll numbers of his life.
Do you find it ironic that as somebody who has spent so much time focusing on John Kennedy and somebody who admitted a mistake, become the archivist for the Richard Nixon Library, because to his death he never admitted, or he never apologized for Watergate, did he?
Oh, well, there's some rich ironies, but it's also I view this as a single period, and I actually think that presidential libraries can serve the public really well when they encourage discussion and debate and exploration about an era. It's not just the person. I mean, after all, we're not a monarchy. We're a republic. So these men, and I hope someday women, come to dominate eras, but they are eras nonetheless. No, I think that the Kennedy versus Nixon election of 1960 was one of the most interesting, and both of those figures are worthy of discussion. I think Nixon could have learned something from Kennedy about how he handled the Bay of Pigs, but there was such rivalry between these two men, even though they apparently liked each other in the 50s, certainly, that I'm sure it would have been very difficult for Richard Nixon to learn from him, from the late President Kennedy in the early 1970s.
Our guest is author, historian Timothy Neftali, and our next call comes to us from Boston. Good morning. Welcome. Go ahead, Boston. We'll try Camilla, Georgia. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Yes, I wanted to make a comment. I was in the military at this time, and we had so many troops and aircraft and equipment in the state of Florida, including the Keys, every military base was just loaded with military, and we were all, prepared. And being the Cubans, they wanted the rights to be the first to invade, and get their country back. And shortly after they were, too far to, recall, we got the stand down order, and the officers, the enlisted personnel, no one that I ever ran into was happy about that message. And I just, I'm really sorry, for the Cubans and the country that I think we failed on that situation pretty badly.
Well, sir, you're talking about the stand down order during the Bay of Pigs.
Right.
The U.S. government was not of one mind on the issue of whether the U.S. military should engage in this operation in the last phase. I mean, if the Cuban brigade failed, should the U.S. military go and help it? The president never accepted the view that it should. The CIA, I think, assumed that the U.S. military would become involved at the end. The previous Eisenhower administration probably assumed that the U.S. military would get involved, but Kennedy himself did not. He had been led to believe that he could actually overthrow Castro without the use of the U.S. military. There were a lot of people who felt the same way you did, sir, in April of 1961.
I asked you earlier about Khrushchev and Kennedy. What about Castro and Khrushchev?
Oh, well, you see, Khrushchev was this inveterate optimist, and he had a number of third world leaders that he worked with, and he always assumed they would behave better than they did. Castro was willful. Castro was not a Soviet puppet, certainly not in this era. Castro became a communist. He wasn't in the beginning, and Khrushchev found him very hard to work with. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's a different issue, but nonetheless relevant, Khrushchev finds out that Castro is recommending that the Soviets use nuclear missiles against the United States if necessary to protect the island and its revolution. And when Khrushchev hears this, he goes wild. He thinks, how on earth could the Cubans expect that we, the Soviet Union, are going to launch a nuclear war on their behalf? The whole point of sending missiles to Cuba was so that you would not have to have a nuclear war. So Khrushchev found Castro extremely difficult to work with, but he felt it was necessary for the Soviet Union to maintain this island republic because, in a sense, the Cuban Revolution was the first nationalist revolution to go communist. The Cuban Revolution was the model for how the Soviets hoped other countries would go from being pro-American to ultimately pro-Soviet. The Soviets had friends in Egypt, but Egypt never went in the same direction. The Soviets had friends in Iraq. Iraq didn't take the same road. They had friends in Indonesia, the same. It was Cuba that was the first really to show how you go from a nationalist revolution to a second socialist revolution. And Khrushchev wanted, at all costs, to save that. And so he had to deal with Castro.
Next call, Dunedin in Florida. Good morning, Republican line.
Yes, good morning. I look forward to reading your book, Mr. Nashali.
Thank you.
And currently I am reading a book titled The 50-Year Wound by Derek Leibert. Really good book, and it does highlight some of the Bay of Pigs scandal. That's my word, of course. But what I'm learning in this book is that, and something we already all know, is how America seem to get it colossally wrong. We find ourselves in open-ended conflicts, and with the Bay of Pigs, it seems to me that we went in there with secretively with an ideal idea to have America be protected from the Soviets, but what a colossal mistake that whole thing turned out to be. It just seems to me that it just wasn't planned out. It was just colossally a mess, embarrassingly a mess, and we all know that. But my question is not just to belittle my country, but what do you think would happen today if, and no disrespect, but if Castro was to, move aside or pass on or what have you? What do you think? How do you think Cuba today would evolve from here?
Thank you, caller. And there have been some reports that Fidel Castro has been in poor health recently.
Mm-hmm. Although there have been reports about his poor health for a long time. A friend and colleague of mine, Brian Littell, has written a very good book about Cuba after Fidel, and Raúl is Fidel's designated successor, and Raúl is his brother, and Raúl is about 2 or 3 years younger than he is, so we're not talking about a younger generation coming to power. The Cuban military very much wants to hold on to hold control of the island, but how long can that last? I don't know. There's some good people at the University of Miami who are following this closely. But I want to get to the caller's first point, which is this issue of, really it's the broader covert action. Should the United States, and under what circumstances, overthrow other countries? It's a tough question, and we've never gotten it right. We don't really have, every generation of Americans answers this question differently. There are people around the world who would do us ill. There are people around the world who run their countries in a way we don't like. But is that a reason to overthrow them? And if you do overthrow them, how are you sure that whatever follows is not anarchy, isn't chaos, which makes things worse? There isn't a single answer, and anybody, I mean, if somebody gives you a single answer, they're not thinking very clearly about it. It's on an issue-by-issue basis. But what general line that you can see throughout this history, Republican or Democrat, is that time and again, people will come to Washington and they'll be filled with hubris. And they'll say, you know what? People out there love democracy so much. All we have to do is light a spark, and they will follow. They will overthrow their dictator, but the dictators of the left or the right. And it generally just, it doesn't happen. And part of that, I think, is that so many of the people that make policy at the highest levels in our government have no cultural background in the countries that they're analyzing. They don't know the languages of the country. They can't read the newspapers of the country. They are dependent upon general theories and on pretty loose analyses from the rest of the government for their decisions. They don't really know these countries. Something that has to be kept in mind when you think about the Bay of Pigs is that many of the people who were responsible for planning the Bay of Pigs in the CIA had planned a successful covert action in Guatemala in 1954. That covert action, as we know now because the materials have been declassified, was a near-run thing. It almost failed. And it didn't succeed because of what the CIA did. But these fellas didn't know that. And so 7 years later, they think, you know, these structures in these third world countries are really, really fragile. We just have to have a big wind and blow them all down. Well, they were wrong about why they succeeded in 1954, and by trying to implement the same plan in 1961, they were wrong again, and this time it came to failure.
A couple of emails. Please ask Mr. Naftali, what was Alan Dulles' role in setting up the Bay of Pigs, and what was his reaction to being retired? Who was his replacement, and why did he or didn't he support the invasion? This viewer from Massachusetts.
Well, Alan Dulles was getting quite old by then. He was a legendary intelligence figure from World War II. He wasn't the brains behind the Bay of Pigs. The brains behind the Bay of Pigs was a man named Richard Bissell. Richard Bissell was another golden boy in Washington. He had overseen the U-2 project, the Overhead Reconnaissance Project. He had been involved in the Marshall Plan. Usually whatever he touched turned to gold. He was dismayed by the failure of the Bay of Pigs, but he blamed Kennedy. He said, you know, if Kennedy had launched the second airstrike and we had achieved air superiority, then 2 of our ships would not have been destroyed by Cuban airplanes, and the thing would have succeeded. Alan Dulles was replaced by John McCone. John McCone had no real position on the Bay of Pigs, but he very much disliked Castro, and he would work with the Kennedys to try to overthrow Castro using other means in 1962.
And the relationship between Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles?
Brothers.
Next call comes to us from Houston. Good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. I find today's topic very enlightening. Actually Cuban American, born October 28th, and if you can imagine, I was born in this country. Bay of Pigs has a lot of meaning to me. I'm a Democrat, and I'm wondering, over all these years, we have, our country is basically, we are dealing with China, we're dealing with the Soviet Union, the walls have come down, and we have no diplomatic ties apparently with Cuba, and no exchange, and therefore this wall has stayed up with Cuba. And what can we do for the future as far as maybe turning Cuba into a democracy? When are we going to start engaging the Cubans? And I'll sit back to answer.
I guess when Florida no longer matters in the electoral map, sir. Look, what did we learn from the end of the Cold War? I think one of the great lessons was that Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia and Hungary were desperate for a new society. And the models that they had, where did they come from? They came from among the very old generation, from memories of the pre-communist era, but in the younger generation, this came from their knowledge of the West. It came from the fact that they had access to some Western media, and they had access to Western culture. It was very helpful to the world that the transition to democracy in these countries was as smooth as it was, and it was as smooth as it was because the people of these countries knew what they wanted. It's self-defeating for us to try to wall off Cuba. It's in our interest to spread ideas of democracy and Western culture there. Fortunately for us, the Canadians and the Spaniards and most of the world have continued to interact with the Cubans, and so the Cubans do have a sense of what democracy, what promise democracy holds for them. It's an artifact of the Cold War, and I think a result of our electoral system, that we have this Chinese wall between us and Cuba. It's a political and strategic mistake. I do wish it were removed.
Some upcoming books by our guest, Timothy Naftali, who is the author of Khrushchev's Cold War, George Herbert Walker Bush, that book coming out next year, part of the American President series, and a book on the rise and fall of the CIA, due out when?
Well, now with my new job, I'm not really sure. I hope 2010, but I'm going to be pretty busy at the Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. The Khrushchev book, if I may say something about it, that I wrote with Alexander Fursenko, with whom I wrote One Hell of a Gamble. We got some really interesting stuff on Khrushchev, and our objective was to do what American analysts really had a hard time doing in the Cold War, which is actually to step in the shoes of the adversary and think about what they were thinking. And it's really interesting to view the Cold War from the other side. I mean, they're tough, and they were nasty, and Khrushchev could be very belligerent. But it's rather interesting to just walk through these events that we know so well from our perspective and see how they thought about it. You'll learn a lot that way.
Miami is next. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Yes, I am a second generation from the Cuban community. I lived in Cuba when I was a kid, and I can tell you that Timothy is putting the facts right the way they are. The invasion was a total disaster due to all the changes in plans that, excuse me, that Canada did. But also I wanted to say that democracy in Cuba will be very hard to come in because of the ability of Castro having the charisma and being able to convince people of him being a good guy. And now, I'm not the old school Cuban. You will hear that they will all see just black and white, but I can tell you that it's very hard for the democracy to come in when people are very afraid to talk to each other, and when the outsiders of the countries that we go and visit Cuba as a tourist, and we see the outer
Oh.
layer of the system, and we can actually not dig into what the real people go through in the system. It will be a little bit hard to bring the democracy if we don't open the doors.
Thank you, caller. And Tim Naftali, let me take it one step further and ask you about this email. If the Bay of Pigs were a success, what would possibly have happened? War with the Soviet Union?
No, not at the time of the Bay of Pigs. The Soviets didn't have much of a presence in Cuba. In fact, one of the consequences of the Bay of Pigs is the KGB sent more people to bolster the Cuban intelligence service. No, there wouldn't have been a war with the Soviets. The Soviets would have licked their wounds. They might have put some pressure on Berlin. Whenever Khrushchev felt weak somewhere in the Third World, he would respond in an area where he thought the Soviet Union enjoyed a conventional advantage over the Americans, and that was in Central Europe. So they might have put a little bit of pressure again. Well, ultimately they would anyway, but they put more pressure on Berlin. But that wouldn't have brought war. The Soviets did not want war because they knew they were behind. Now, they wanted to win in the sense that they wanted the next generation to live under communism, but they weren't willing to do it at the point of the spear because they knew the consequences were disastrous for them. I just wanted to mention something in response to the nice caller. It's really hard to build democracies in other countries. I hope that in Iraq, I know we shouldn't be talking about Iraq, but it should be a lesson for people that it takes a long time to build democratic institutions. You know, if you think some of our great democratic institutions, some of the most important institutions in our society were not created by the founders. They came 100 years later, more than 100 years later. It takes a long time. If you look at our history, you look at British history, you look at Canadian history, it just doesn't happen overnight. So why should we assume that it will somewhere else? The point about the way Cubans live, the Cuban government allowed the historians and the sort of officials in our delegation, they took us to a missile site, which was very interesting, but to get there we had to go through parts of Cuba that aren't normally seen by visitors, and the caller was absolutely right. If you go to Cuba as a beachgoer, you're going to stay in a little island, little colony area, which is pretty nice. If you get outside of those resort areas, you see the poverty, and it is just heartbreaking and unnecessary. Cuba could be a reasonably rich country, certainly the richest in the Caribbean, and it isn't. I hope that'll change sometime.
Last call for our guest is from San Rafael, California. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN. Really interesting, Mr. Naftali. It's a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you.
I was in the Navy during all this. In fact, about 6 years prior to that, and then I stayed in for another 2 years after it was over. And I was involved in training and working with some of the Cuban expatriate pilots.
Where were you stationed at the time?
Bethesda, Maryland. But I was TAD down to this with special orders. It was a special program. And it was interesting, from my perspective, because I was in the service during the Eisenhower administration and then carried over into the Kennedy administration. And one of the things that, it's true, some of the other servicemen, I've been listening to your whole program, and you can hear some of the angst, and one fellow, I suppose, was an enlisted man, you could sort of tell, and that they were, upset and angry with Kennedy for allegedly what he did. But what most people don't realize is this whole thing was planned during the Eisenhower administration. And the military was very much involved in it. There were, like the one man talking about the bases in Florida, there were, I'm sure, thousands and thousands of people that were on all kinds of alerts under the Eisenhower administration.
It's true. But I would say that the Joint Chiefs of Staff failed in its responsibility to the President. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were given copies of the military plan that the CIA drafted, and these plans weren't very good. And the Joint Chiefs decided basically to withdraw and say, well, the civilian leadership, the civilian intelligence community wants to do this. These aren't very good plans. It's not going to work, but that's okay. It's their baby. And the Joint Chiefs, they didn't initiate this, so they don't deserve most of the blame. but they did not really come in with the advice that they should have, and Kennedy was furious with them afterwards. One of the things that comes out of this experience for Kennedy is deep suspicion of the military leadership, what he does is he asks his brother Bobby, who is Attorney General and not a player in national security affairs up to that point, to play a much, much bigger role as an advisor in national security. And from the Bay of Pigs, you have the Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy alliance in national security, which also will produce some peculiarities, because they will be talking about elements of U.S.-Soviet relations that McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor, and Dean Russ, the Secretary of State, don't know about. But again, one of the consequences of the Bay of Pigs is that Kennedy becomes very suspicious of the leadership of the intelligence community and of the military.
Timothy Naftali, who's the author of a number of books, including One Hell of a Gamble, on this 45th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion, we thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. My pleasure.
Tomorrow morning, by the way, we'll take a closer look at another part of American history, Benjamin Franklin. We will be live from the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, and a look at the exhibit on Benjamin Franklin, In Search of a Better World. That's tomorrow morning as part of C-SPAN's Washington Journal. We are going to take a short break, and when we come back, we will introduce you to yet another contest winner in C-SPAN's Student Cam contest as we continue on this Monday, April the 17th.